Hello folks, and welcome back to the workshop for a product preview. Now you can see here we have a big Pelly case branded with Corsair Hydro X on the front, box number 7. What does this contain? Well, you've probably already seen it actually, because we're filming this before Computex and now is after Computex, where all this stuff will have been shown off at their booth and even in our own content. So the idea here is we're going to be taking a look at the parts themselves, maybe taking them apart, seeing how they're made, how they're going to work. And instead of doing an actual build, because we're going to do that later when we've had a bit more time to get used to the kit and plan out some things, because it's got to, we've got to do a good job with this. Instead, what we're going to do is a bit of a breakdown and see what we can learn about the parts themselves and how they're going to be working. So I think it's about time we take a look and see what's inside this box. So essentially, Hydro X is Corsair's entry into the custom water cooling scene. And what they're trying to do is basically get into the market and make it more accessible to beginners and also for pros alike, and offer some interesting options. So what we've got here to start with are 2 CPU blocks, 2 GPU blocks, and a pump reservoir combo. So the CPU blocks that we've got today are the XC7 RGB, which is going to be for the standard smaller consumer sockets, so AM4 and LGA 115X sockets for Intel. And then we've also got the bigger enthusiast block, which is the XC9, and that's going to be for TR4, so Threadripper, and for Intel socket 2066. So that's the big boy one, that's the little one. For the GPU blocks, we've got an RTX 2080 block here, and we're going to be taking a look at this one a little bit later and taking it apart. For the pump and reservoir unit, we've got a D5 based RGB reservoir, and that's got LEDs in the top and the bottom and should be able to work with all the other ecosystem parts, which we're going to be covering in a moment. Essentially, the main selling point of all this gear is the RGB ecosystem. So Corsair is pretty well known for trying to put RGB on absolutely everything. You only have to take a look at their cases and fans to see that, but they do have quite an extensive ecosystem going, and these parts are all meant to tie into that. So they're all controllable via the IQ software, and you can actually start to daisy chain them up. So in fact, you can take 4 of these products and daisy chain them into one piece that goes into, say, a Lighting Node Pro or a Commander Pro controller, which you can then stow wherever. That way you can have it synced up with your case lighting or maybe the fans, and of course your other Corsair peripherals, if you have any, such as headsets, keyboards, that sort of thing. One of the interesting things about that is that there's not really a huge amount of competition in that regard, because whilst lots of components have RGB in them, not everyone has a full RGB ecosystem going, especially not with their own custom software for it. So if you're going to be looking at maybe a competitor like an EK product or something from Watercool, then they have RGB headers on them, but they're not all going to be addressable RGB like these ones, and they don't have their own software packages, or at least not yet, some of them might do in the future, that you can control everything and keep it all consistent. The other thing is, of course, Corsair does memory and other similar parts like that, so you'll be able to tie it into those things as well. Now, RGB is one thing, but it doesn't really mean anything if the parts themselves are pants. So I think we're going to have a closer look at how each one of these parts is made and what goes into and how you're going to be installing and what you're going to be using. Now, I do water cooling all the time. This is basically my bread and butter. So I'm interested to see how this stacks up with some of the other parts that I've used. And if you're new to this channel, by the way, make sure to check out the previous videos where you can see some of the projects that we've done with the water cooling scene. So let's see how they stack up by taking a look at the CPU blocks first. So opening up the boxes, what have we got? Well, you've got your standard instruction manuals and warranty booklets and things. So these parts come with a 3-year warranty, which is across all the range here. And inside the consumer one, we've got various mounting brackets. So you've got your back plate, which goes on behind your motherboard, your mounting screws. We've got an AM4 bracket, obviously because they have like a rectangular mount rather than the square one that you get with Intel. And you've got your block itself. Largely the same story here for the TR4 and 2066 socket, only this one's silver. And we'll come around to why that is in a second. This also comes with your TR4 bracket, which goes around the outside, around the outside, around the outside. Now, it's worth mentioning that obviously lighting is an incredibly important part of these products. So how is it handled? Well, if we take a closer look, there's an LED ring that goes around this portion of the block. And this has a pigtail. Now, the thing is, I said you could daisy chain the parts. Now, this is obviously the case, except this block has to go at the very end of the chain because there is no socket to add something. So you can't, for instance, have your GPUs going to this one here, and then maybe having another one going up to some LED strips that you might have on the top or something like that. Nope, it has to end on this block, which is a little bit of a shame, personally. I'm also not a huge fan of the fact they've got this really long wire. It would have been nice, I think, if they'd had like a plug socket like you get on the pump units themselves. So if you have like an all-in-one, then you quite often had little plugs for the USB sockets and other things like that. It would have been nice if they'd gone with that approach rather than putting pigtails and everything, because these are sometimes too short or too long and it becomes a bit tricky. I'd rather have something you can just plug in. Now it's exactly the same for this one, and actually quite a lot of it is exactly the same. Just looking at them, I can't actually tell the difference between them. I think they're exactly the same, just with different brackets. Now, why is this one silver and why is this one black? Well, this is all made of plastic on here, so this is injection molded. In fact, most of these are injection molded. This, however, is aluminium, but you probably wouldn't know it because it's got exactly the same finish as the plastic. So I'm not entirely sure why they've done that. Quite frankly, they've gone with a sand-blasted look. I think a glass-blasted, more premium look would have been a better idea, because then it would be similar to, say, an Apple product or something, where you know that's actually metal rather than plastic, because you're just going to have to take my word for it that this is metal. It even sounds like plastic, but it is metal. I mean, it's cold. You can tell the difference when you pick it up, but it's very, very thin. And these blocks, they weigh absolutely nothing, and that's because they're made out of very, very thin cold plates, so they haven't got a great big wedge of copper that you'll find on some of the other water cooling blocks around. And all these parts are injection molded. Now, that's an interesting point, because injection molding has some major benefits, but also some drawbacks that I'm not so certain about. And on some of the products that I've seen already injection molded, they're not so good. So we'll take a closer look. So the first thing to mention is that they've gone with, instead of, say, machined acrylic, this is injection molded nylon for the top. Now, the idea there is that it keeps it incredibly clear. Now, that's a good thing, because you can see your coolant running through it, and it's not going to have any machining marks and things like that. Where I'm a little bit iffy is the whole thing is injection molded, which includes the threads. So I'm a little bit worried that maybe if you over tighten, maybe you could over time strip these threads, but I can imagine they've probably tested that. It's probably fine. And nylon is quite a tough material if used properly, and it is very clear. The only thing is, I'm not a huge fan of the way that it warps around things, and I think it looks a little bit cheap, if I'm honest. The thumb screws, these are very nice. I like these square look. I think a lot of the time the thumb screws aren't really looked at, and they are very visible in a build. So if you've got ugly thumb screws, they do actually tend to stick out, and sometimes I've had to replace existing ones with fancier ones that I've maybe plated in another metal or done other things like that. I quite like this black nickel finish. I think that's really quite good, and it also ties onto these back plates and retention brackets. So this is the same sort of thing that you'll find on one of the hydro units, so all ties together quite nicely. Typically, the mounting mechanisms for the Corsair all-in-ones have always been pretty good. I like the fact that you can mount them very quickly, and they tend to do a very good job. So I would assume, because we're not doing this right now, these are going to be the same. And it certainly seems that way. However, let's take a closer look inside the box themselves and see how you open them up. Again, this is custom water cooling, and whilst Corsair says they want to keep it all nice and accessible and easy to get into, you need to be able to have your blocks be easy to get into as well. So let's take a look and see what they're like on the inside. So the way you get into the blocks is by opening them up from the underneath. Now you'll see here we've also got pre-applied thermal paste. That's very similar to the all-in-ones. I quite like that. It's nice and simple. But let's see how we actually get through. This is an awful lot of screws, so bear with me. So 3 screwdrivers later, we've got the block apart. Now, what do each of these different parts signify? So the majority of the weight of the block and the cooling is going to come from this part here, which is the base plate. So this is made out of copper and is nickel plated. Now the idea there being it's going to be corrosion resistant, and also it looks quite nice. We'll be shining the lights all back and things. If it was just left pure copper, obviously it'd be completely resistant and not have any issues potentially with flaking, but then you've got a great big red pinkish metal sticking out, and I think that doesn't really fit with the Corsair look that they're going for. Now it's got an incredibly dense fin array. I mean, this is one of, if not the densest fin stacks that I've ever seen in one of these blocks. And it has a lot in common with the all-in-ones. So if you have open up an all-in-one, which generally you don't ever need to do, but if you do, they tend to look quite similar to this. They'll have like a thin-ish base plate, and they'll have the fin stack sticking out of the top. And they've basically gone for the exact same approach here. And it's held in place by quite a few of these absolutely tiny Torx self-tapping screws. Now the reason they're self-tapping is because that fits straight into this thing, which is the injection molded top. So this is made out of clear nylon, and it has inside of it like a jet plate type arrangement. And on top of that, there's yet another piece, which I didn't even notice beforehand, which is this little plastic tab thing, which I think is just another part of the jet plate assembly. Most of the ones I've seen these are actually made of steel. So it's interesting that this one's made out of very, very flexible, you'd have thought easy to damage plastic, but I guess you're not really supposed to open them up and fiddle around with them. But anyway, that's the way that is. The LEDs are all around the ring of the metal piece here, and you can really see this is a very, very lightweight piece of aluminium. It's been cast into shape and then sandblasted. Again, I don't really see the point in this necessarily being aluminium because it doesn't really feel like it. But if you did want to take this and maybe sand it down, polish it up, it's possible. It's a very difficult shape to work with though, so you might find that quite challenging. Interesting point though, it's got a little light up Corsair LED kind of logo thing there, which has either been laser etched or EDM machined in or something. Probably laser etched because it's much faster. It's the same sort of thing that you'll find on a MacBook power button or something like that. So it's quite nice because then you can have the logo shine through the metal itself. The only thing that I'm not so fond of in terms of the shape here is that obviously you're sort of stuck in just one arrangement. You can either go that way or you can go that way, or, well, no, you can't even really do that because the logo is obviously pointing one direction, so you're sort of stuck in one orientation. Now, not all blocks can be rotated, especially for the TR4 ones, because the actual mounting bracket itself is a rectangle, so you can't, most of the other blocks in the market you can't rotate, so it's not a huge deal. It's a bit more of an issue for the consumer socket one, because quite often you might want to rotate it to the side so you can have tubes going one way or going up or down or what have you. So it's a little bit of a shame that you're not really going to be able to do that without making it very obvious that you have rotated it. So one of the key sticking points I have with the injection molded route is that it doesn't always seem to play very nicely with some of the stronger coloured coolants. So I've seen it with other manufacturers. So for instance, EK Water Blocks used to put an injection molded piece, and they might still do on some of the blocks, into the EK Supremacy Evo line. And whilst it's a very efficient way of redirecting the flow, much like this one, I did notice that if you're using a strong coolant such as red, now red is notorious for staining components, it really did get stuck into that piece and it made it very difficult to remove it. And you'd often just have to replace that particular piece itself. Not a huge problem because those pieces aren't very expensive, but it's still a bit frustrating and it doesn't seem to stain anything like as much on acrylic parts. It still can do, but it just doesn't seem to do it as much. And I'm thinking that maybe long term, you might have difficulty swapping coolant colors with something like this. It's not that hard to access and clean, but the other thing is this plastic's very soft, so when you do clean it, you run the risk of introducing scratches, which could make it look foggy, especially since you've got LEDs all the way around it, so every little imperfection is just going to show up. In terms of performance, I would expect the fact that this is quite a thin plate and with a very dense fin stack, it should perform quite well, but obviously we can't test that right now. We'll have to see what it's like in the actual build. The other thing that's worth noting is that sometimes with these very dense fin arrays, they can get blocked. So for instance, if you have a radiator which has a little bit of gunk in it, or maybe you're using soft tubing which has a habit of leaching plasticizers, even if they say that it doesn't have plasticizers, they always seem to go cloudy and get into the loop. If you've got really, really dense fins like these ones, sometimes that can cause trouble. So it'll be interesting seeing how that plays out in the long run. For the most part, you're going to be fine. And of course, if you stick within the Corsair ecosystem, you're going to be covered by their warranties and other similar things like that. So that's probably the way to go for these. But it'll be interesting to see how they play with some of the other coolants on the market potentially. Pricing wise, you're looking at $74.99 roughly for the larger socket one, and it's going to be lower, $69.99 for the consumer socket version. Now, That does put it below some of the competition. So the EK velocity blocks are sort of around the 90 to 100 pound range, depending on which version you go for. But it does also mean that you're sort of dangerously close to the area of water cool. And whilst you're not going to have the same addressable RGB ecosystem, I think you're going to get a more solid block that's made out of like a huge chunk of copper and brass and nickel plated all over. I think that makes this a little bit tricky in terms of the selling point, given that so much of it is injection molded or just cast into place rather than machined, and lacks that sort of feel and panache that some of the other blocks that I would expect from a custom water loop solution. So next up on the list are the GPU blocks. Now the one we've got here is for the 2080 Founders Edition. They've also got the 2080 Ti, which we've got over there, along with the Vega 64, 1080 Ti Founders Edition, and also the Strix versions of these cards. So what's going on with this one? Well, the majority of this card is actually metal. So this is all aluminium. I think that's really quite nice. Now the looks itself may divide opinion. You may not, be a huge fan of this particular aesthetic, but it is quite solid, and you could always, if you wanted, maybe paint them or anodize them differently. Aesthetics is purely a preference thing, so it's hard to say this looks good, because it might not, or it might look good in a different circumstance. I think it actually looks quite nice in person. I think the angles and things are quite pleasing. Also, it's got a good weight to it. It's just a completely different beast to the CPU blocks. So the more you look at this, the more you can see how many things have been machined rather than just injection molded. In fact, the only obvious injection molding piece that I've got here is the terminal. Now that's a little bit of a shame, because that's also arguably one of the most important parts of the entire water block, because that's how you're going to get your fittings and everything to attach to it. So it's a little bit of a shame that they've injection molded these parts here for seemingly no real reason other than cost saving as far as I can see. But at least the terminal itself does look very nice. So you can see they've got the Hydro X branding on the front here, and this is very, very similar in shape to the Dominator Platinum memory. And I really like that shape. It's a nice finish to it. Again, this is the finish, this lovely sort of glass beaded aluminium here. That's the finish they should have had on the CPU block. So I'm a bit curious as to why they've got such a lovely finish on the terminal here, and the finish doesn't seem to match up at all on the CPU block. But regardless, we're going to be taking this thing apart and taking a closer look. One of the cool things, of course, is that it comes with the thermal paste already applied, and also the thermal pads already applied. Now, every block that I've ever used, you've had to do this yourself. And when you've got like bigger cards covered in things, it actually takes quite a long time. And I've had to do builds where you've got maybe 4 graphics cards in there, and you're having to chop up tiny little pieces of these thermal pads and making sure you've got the right thicknesses and the right places. And I see so many posts online where maybe you've redone a block or you've added something and something's gone wrong and people have to buy new ones. That's actually a really difficult thing to deal with as a newcomer. So the fact that these come pre-applied, I think, is an absolutely great idea. The other difference with the CPU block and the GPU block is that, yes, whilst they still have pigtails, you do now have a male one and a female one. So you could daisy chain. So if you, for instance, have 2 graphics cards, or you want to be able to plug this into the CPU, which would be a nice clean run because it would go straight from the top down to the slot, then that's quite good. It'll make sure that there's not going to be tons of cables flowing all over the place. Another cool little feature that you can see here, if you look closely, is it has a flow indicator built in. Now this particular one isn't an electronic kind, so it doesn't go to any reader or USB readout, but it does allow you to see that your coolant is flowing, and sometimes it's a nice little feature to be able to see that. People do put flow indicators as dedicated fittings. Instead, you could use this if you've got it, say, in a vertical arrangement. You'll be able to see it, and it's a nice little visual flair. For that matter, that's the reason why I focus on the terminal so much, because quite often, if your card is sat in a sort of a classic arrangement, it's almost the only thing you see of a water block. So it's quite important, in my opinion, to have a nice looking terminal. Now, in terms of additional extras, this block comes with a backplate. This isn't a structural one, it's just a plastic one with a nice fascia on it, but it's got a lovely brushed finish. So if you've got your card sitting horizontally like this, it'll sit like so on top and make it look quite neat. It also comes with your little screw packs for getting everything working. It's nice and simple, not a huge amount of stuff in there. And you've got 2 stop plugs Now, unfortunately, these are also little plastic ones rather than metal, so you probably want to put your own ones in there, I would expect. But they do come with, so you're not going to have to worry about having too few ports, because you're going to have 2 of these stock plugs in the packet, and you're going to want to use 2 fittings, one going in, one going out anyway, so that's fine. It also comes with this little tool here, which is for putting your stock plugs in. And, you know, given that no one has coins nowadays because we've all gone cashless, I think that's a nice little feature. So let's actually take this thing apart and see how they've made bits. That's fantastic machining. With the block now apart, we can see how the parts were actually made. So the cold plate itself has been CNC milled from a solid block of copper, and the machining is really quite good, and it's been nickel plated on top of that. So you can see there are some faint machining marks, but if you run your fingers over them, they're very, very smooth, and that's absolutely no different to anything you're likely to find from any other manufacturer. So I'm very pleased with this. I like the way that the flow meter is very, very simple. It just plops in place, likely not to fail or clog or anything like that. Again, you have a very dense fin array, which is very similar to the CPU block in that way. That's definitely a good thing because you're going to get more surface area, more and theoretically more cooling. Again, I'm a little bit apprehensive maybe if you've got other coolants that could clog, or maybe if you've got PVC tubing, but that remains to be seen, and perhaps it would be fine. But in any case, this is actually really quite nice, and it's all serviced together by a thick O-ring. I mean, this is a very thick O-ring. A lot of the ones I've seen are much smaller, so that should give you a very good seal. And you've got a nice tasteful implementation of the LEDs which go along the side here, which are kept underneath the metal shroud. So you're not going to be seeing any visible LEDs, only the lighting itself diffusing through the block. So how do the LEDs themselves diffuse through it? Well, that's all handled by this part. And this is what I was expecting, quite frankly, from the CPU block, because this is machined excellently. In fact, it's incredibly clear. You don't even know that it has been machined. I thought at first it might have been injection molded, but I can't see any molding marks, but I can see very faint machining marks. And in this case, I think that's a good thing. And it really does look fantastic. It's very clear, very, very clear, in fact. And you can see how it's probably picking up the light in the camera. And that should look fantastic with your coolant running through, and it should be nice and resistant to staining. You can see the terminal bolts onto the side here by using these sort of thumb screws here. They're not really thumb screws. You will have to use an Allen wrench to be able to get into those. And that's hidden behind the terminal cover, which secures to the front of it in exactly the same way that the Dominator Platinum heat spreaders do, just with a few screws that go along the outside. It sort of slots in place like so. There's not a huge amount to say about it. We're going to have to see how it performs in reality, but I do like the fact that it comes as one cohesive package. It's going to be easy to install, doesn't have all the pads missing, then you need to put them in yourself, and the finish is really quite good. It has a nice weight to it, so it's not lightweight, and it's got some proper solidity to it, which I think every GPU block should have. Also, being able to chain multiple cards together for the lighting, I think is going to be pretty good, because if you have 2, that means you can then have the effects roll from one card to the other, all the way from the CPU block as well. So I think that's pretty good. Now we have the reservoir and pump combo. Now what's special about this thing? Well, you've got LEDs that run around the top in one distinct ring. So you've got 10 LEDs up there with a straggly cable that comes out the bottom, which you're going to have to hide, but there's not much you can do about that with LEDs at the top. Maybe it would have been nice if there was like a channel that came down here, but neither here nor there. You've got LEDs, you can always remove them if you don't want them. And you've got a D5 pump. Now what's good about this is that this is a genuine Xylem D5 pump made in Hungary. It's the proper real deal, and if you're buying any water cooling parts, if you don't ever skimp out on your pump. So this is a good one. It says it's rated for 800 litres per minute. Now you will see that some places will say 1500 litres. They're the same units. Corsair says that that's based on real world values rather than theoretical values. All I know is that I always use D5 or DDC pumps in all of my loops, and they've always just worked. You're better off just making sure you pay for the correct one. They are pricier than some of the alternatives, but you're just going to have a better day if you actually do that. Now, how does this actual unit work, and what does it come with? Well, in the box, you get one of these, which is a bracket. Now this one is designed to go around the pump unit itself. So we remove this little piece of cardboard. I should be able to show you how it slots. So this is made out of stamped steel, which has been given a nice polished nickel, sort of dark nickel finish. Just slide it over. Get all those wires and things through. Probably easier if you actually disconnect them all. And that slots like that. So that means if you have something either sitting on the base or you want to have it against the back of your case or someplace like that on a reservoir mount, that's how you do it. It has screw mounting points on the back, the top and the bottom. You'll also find in the box these two things. So much like that one, these are mounting brackets for 120 and 140 millimeter fan spacing. So you can either put it on a radiator or just a slot that you may have on the base or some other part of your case. Now this is really good because a lot of the other alternatives don't come with them, so you'll have to get them separately. And if you're a beginner, trying to remember that stuff is actually really quite difficult because you don't really know that you have to do that. And actually, even if you're an experienced builder, you'll quite often forget because some manufacturers will provide options like these and others won't. So you have to make sure you do research, and that can get tricky. And I've certainly had a couple times where I thought I've bought everything that I need for a loop, only to find that I have to make a bracket out of nowhere because I forgot to add one to the basket. So having these in the box, I think is very beginner friendly, and it's a really good idea. Now the only thing that I'm a little bit stumped by is I was told that these are sort of springy soft steel because it helps absorb vibration. Now, my personal experience with that is sort of the opposite, actually. Usually you want to have your mounts as solid as you possibly can, or just made out of dampening materials like rubber. So having them out of stamped steel, I'd have thought would actually increase the vibration for the pump and increase the noise. But supposedly it does the opposite. I guess we're going to have to see that later on when we actually do the proper build and see if it holds water. Also inside here, you're going to get a bridging plug. Now this is quite good because it allows you to fill up your loop without powering on the rest of your components, and it's nice that they've included one of these. You also get more plugs in the same kind of way as the GPU block, along with your handy tool, and various mounting screws and accessories. It also comes with one of these, which is a temperature sensor, which you can add into one of the G1/4 ports, and then it plugs straight into some of the other devices or into your USB sockets and things like that. So that way you can monitor the temperature of your coolant, which is quite good because if you're doing water cooling, it's a good idea to run your fans based on the temperature of your coolant rather than your CPU. The only issue is I don't actually like this at all in terms of the actual reservoir unit. So it's really good that they've gone with a proper pump. I like the fact that it's a PWM pump as well. It's got some really nice sleeving that goes all the way over here. It doesn't go into the terminal, but we have a tutorial on how to do that yourself. So if you do fancy that little mod, it's quite a simple one and it will work exactly the same for this as well. What I don't like about this is, again, it is all injection molded, but every single part of it is this time. So we just pop this top off. So this is the LED ring. That makes perfect sense to me to be fully injection molded. But look at this. We have our top ports are going to be all built into the whole unit. You can't get into it. In fact, it's actually quite difficult to try and deconstruct this. So let's just take it apart now and I'll show you what it looks like on the inside. Now bear with me here because actually taking this thing apart isn't that straightforward. So firstly, we have to remove these little rubber mounting points. So these are good for reducing vibration. We slide off this cover. Now this is no structural thing, it's just a purely aesthetic function. And underneath we have a retention ring, so we need to unscrew that. Oh look, Torx screws, so let's use one of those. We slide the bracket off, and then we can slide the pump. So this is the pump unit itself. Pretty basic. It's just a simple impeller unit. It's cooled by the coolant itself. And the thing I do like though is that they've got a nice matte black finish around the outside. But a lot of pumps don't do that, so I think that's a nice thing. Got your information on the back. And the way this mounts into this is we've got this molded section here, and it has a thick sort of O-ring part here, and that's held in, and that's how it creates the nice watertight seal. But we want to get a little bit further than this, so let's take this part off as well. And that uses another torque screw, but this time an even smaller one. Right, so now we take this top ring off, which is again another aesthetic ring. And now we have more screws, and this time from the top. There we go. So this is the meat of the operation and where the pump will mount into the actual reservoir itself. And on one side we've got an O-ring that faces the reservoir section, and on the other side we've obviously got the pump mount, which I just went over. Now this is held in with an awful lot of screws, and the main reason for that is because you can't thread the injection molded parts, they have to use self-tapping screws. So to be able to get a nice even pressure all along without risk of stripping the screw threads, it's a good idea to have it nice and even and use lots of smaller screws instead. The other thing is, of course, they don't want to have any stress points, because if you've got too much going on at any point, we've got lots of corners here. I have seen other reservoirs which are similar kind of shapes, such as the Swift-Tech Maelstrom. Now that had loads of problems. They don't use the same mounting mechanism, but it's prone to the same sort of thing. I'm hoping that Corsair saw things like that and thought, no, we can do better than that, and came up with this design instead. And it's quite interesting, the fact that it is octagonal. I think that's different. I've not really seen it. Usually they're round or square or something, but round is by far the most common because it's the easiest to work with, and also you can produce it in lots of different materials. But it's interesting that they've gone with this approach. I guess it's unique, and it means that their product will stand out. Personally, I don't really rate it as much. I would actually much rather have a thicker acrylic or even a glass option, actually. My favourite is definitely borosilicate glass, just because it doesn't stain at all and it's really easy to clean. My one reservation here is, of course, you can quite easily, when you've had a system going for a long time, there'll be tiny bits of plasticizer or things like that that have been floating around, or maybe the coolant started to break down. Now, even using high quality coolants, that can happen. I've had it happen myself with systems that I've maybe had running for 1 or 2 years. Even with a couple coolant changes, you eventually lose a little bit of volume, and at the very top you can have like a witness line where your coolant was running. So I prefer not to have that, and trying to clean something like this is quite difficult. Thankfully, this insert does come out, so it's not like one single molded piece. That would have been very impressive technically, but I think this is definitely for the best. So at the base you've got yourself an anti-vortex plate, and the idea here is just it stops it from creating like a vortex which sucks bubbles in and keeps your system nice and air-free, because obviously you don't want to have lots of air going through your computer. It's going to reduce your cooling capacity, and also it'll just make it a lot louder, and it's not very good for the pump either. So that's the purpose of this little piece, and you don't really want to remove it. In terms of port locations, we've actually got quite a lot here that we can use. So this is the outlet. Now that's your only option. You have to go out of that one, but you can go in through here, here, here. So you've got the front, back and sides. You can also go in through the top here, through this tube. Now you won't want to go through this one because that doesn't have a tube on the other side, which means that you're going to be splashing lots of coolant around and introducing bubbles into your system. You want to use that one for filling your loop only instead. But you can go from the top here, optional. So I like the fact that you've got lots of different options and where you can go and what you can do. If you're going to be planning a drain system, cool thing is you can then add maybe a drain part of the loop onto one of these other ports, and that'll make it nice and simple and out of the way. In terms of pricing, this particular unit is going to be retailing at about £150, and I think that's all right actually, because you've got a lot of RGB implementation. That might not be your thing, but even without that, it's still a modestly priced reservoir just because you've got the pump itself. And if you want to buy one of these by themselves, you're going to be looking at between £70 and £90 depending on which version you pick up. This is the PWM version, so it does have the bells and whistles on it, and that is a good thing. I'm not really a fan of the actual reservoir itself, but that might be down more to personal preference and the fact that I like materials like borosilicate glass or the thicker acrylics. I, for instance, wouldn't be able to do much in the way of modding with something like this because I wouldn't be able to introduce it into a more complex water loop. But again, I'm also probably not the kind of person who this kit is aimed at. So if you're a beginner, actually this is going to be quite an easy thing to get running. And the fact that it comes with all of the mounting accessories, all the parts like that, I think is a really good thing, and it's going to make it much easier to use. So we've had a look at the actual water blocks themselves along with the pump and res combo, but obviously a water loop is a lot more than just that. You're going to need your tubing, your fittings, your coolant and your radiators to be able to do the actual heat dissipation itself. So what direction have Corsair gone with that? Well, you can see we have an awful lot of stuff, and one of the interesting things is instead of trying to sort of reinvent the wheel, what Corsair's done is they've reached out to different manufacturing partners to go the OEM route. So you'll find probably a lot of this stuff looks quite familiar, and we'll be delving into why that is in a second. But the other issue, of course, with a custom loop is how do you know what's going into it? Now, if you're a bit experienced and you've done a few loops before, it's not necessarily that difficult shopping around and finding exactly what you need. But if you're a newcomer to it, trying to figure out what size fittings to get, how many, how much tubing, where you're going to be putting it, what kind of blocks, that's actually really quite difficult because there are so many options on the market, and sometimes it's not always that clear what you need to do. So to get around this, Corsair's made a configuration suite which they're going to have up on their website. Now, at the time of filming, it's not yet operational, so I can't actually show you that, unfortunately, but by the time this airs, it should be up so you can play around with it. The idea being is it's going to have a bunch of Corsair cases, plus a load of water cooling components, plus some additional ones that will basically construct a loop for you. Now, of course, you can edit that and change things around, but the basic premise is it's going to help you choose which parts you're going to need and also check out for things like compatibility. Are you going to be able to fit your given radiators in a case, or make sure that your water blocks are the right ones for your hardware? It also has a inbuilt feature which kind of calculates roughly how much radiator you're going to need for your given hardware, along with some other handy things like the ability to buy all the components from the single configurator itself. Of course, if you're more experienced and you've done some stuff before, you don't necessarily need to use it, but I think it's a nice feature to have, and some of the existing ones in the market already help people a lot. In terms of OEM choices, I think Corsair made some brilliant decisions here, just because it would have been so much easier to go with the cheapest option. Instead, they went with ones which are known to be quality. So taking a look at the radiators, for instance, you may recognize this as being a Hardware Labs radiator. So Hardware Labs is the OEM for these Corsair parts. And that's fantastic news because they consistently make some of the highest performing radiators that you can buy on the market. They also come with nice features such as M4 threads on the screw, so it's not 632, which is frustrating as anything, and M3 can be quite weak. But these are the thin ones that we've got here, which is similar to the GTS radiators from Hardware Labs, so the 360mm version. And basically, it's pretty much exactly the same, only it has the Corsair branding on the side, which has got a nice shiny sticker to it, and I think that's quite nice. For coolant, they've gone with Mayhem's, and that's a fantastic option as well. So these are the clear ones. And they're going to be offering a few different colours. We've got, for instance, red and blue, and I think there's a purple one as well. And Mayhem's X1 is one of those classic, it just works coolants. I use it a lot in any kind of system where I have to have clear coolant. It just is a fantastically stable product. And the fact that they've gone with them is good. I'm also happy to see that we've got completely clear black bottles. That means you're not going to have issues with light getting in and degrading the coolant itself. So that means a little bit of forethought went into that. Well, that's good. Now, for the fittings, this is a very important part because obviously they are what connect everything together. So what we've got here is Bits Power fittings. And it's not even like they're similar to Bits Power. Bits Power themselves are the OEM. And you can see that as well in a lot of these products. So, like for instance, if we take this manifold fitting, it's got a Corsair logo on the front here just to show that it is a Corsair one. But you can see these classic things like they've got this green silicone O-rings, which Bits Power is known for. They do make other ones, but that's a very famous one. And I'm really happy with this because I've used a lot of Bits Power fittings in the past, and I think they're just a very stable, easy to use product. Similarly, they've got some soft tubing type ones as well as the rigid compressions. And interestingly enough, you'll notice that on a lot of these, there is actually no branding. Now, I don't know if this is maybe a pre-production type thing where maybe they haven't added it yet and they will later on, but certainly at this point, I'm actually really happy that they haven't plastered logos all over the place. Because one of the complaints that you do get with Bits Power fittings is that they put their dragon on absolutely everything. So if you look at a standard Bits Power compression, you'll have 4 dragons, one up here, here, you'll have another one here, all over the place. Now, as you can imagine, if you had the same thing with the Corsair sails, that's an awful lot of sails around. So it's quite, in my opinion, a bold move not to do that. They've also made some really good choices in terms of the kind of tubing that they're going to be supporting. So they've got the standard sort of soft tubing PVC type deal, which is very good for beginners. And if you want to try and make a more impressive loop, or you're moving on or you just want to try something a little bit more challenging, they're also going to be offering acrylic tubing, but not PETG. Now, this is something I actually wholeheartedly agree with because I'm not the biggest fan of PETG. It can warp at higher temperatures, which is important in case you have some kind of failure. Maybe your fans don't quite spin up properly, or you have a blockage somewhere and your coolant temperature rises. That can cause leaks and it's a little bit dangerous. The other thing is, of course, that PETG absolutely hates ethylene glycol. So if you're using a coolant like Mayhem's XT1 or Pastel Extreme, those sort of things, or some of the other manufacturers, that can actually eat away at PETG and react with it. So you don't want to do that. But acrylic is fine with that. Now, acrylic is a little bit harder to use than PETG, but we do have a guide on exactly how to do that, and it's not that difficult in the long run. The other thing is the sizing that they've gone with. So we take a look over here. This is a sample of one of their tubes. This is a 12mm tube. That's a classic size. You'll find it all the time. We used this exact same size in the NVIDIA rig that we did a while ago. But there's another size that they got, and it's not 16mm like the classic that you normally find. It's 14. Now 14 for me is really exciting because quite often 12 looks a little bit too small, especially if you're in a really big computer, like our 1000D for instance. The tubing gets absolutely swallowed up unless you fill it with a ridiculous amount of extra hardware. If you're using a fatter tubing, it sort of fills up that space. The thing is though, 16mm can be a little bit too big. And I feel like the Goldilocks size is actually 14. So it's somewhere between 12 and 16, and it just seems to feel right in most builds. You can actually use 14mm tubing very easily in quite small builds, but also comfortably in the larger ones as well. So I'm very happy to see that they've taken that approach and they're going to be applying that over. Now in terms of future variety and things, we've got quite a few different fittings we've got here. We've got some angled adapters, some 90 degrees, some sort of dual 90 degrees. We've also got a ball valve for your drain system, that sort of thing. Now the idea is there's going to be lots of different finishes as well that are available. So these are the black ones. They're also going to be coming in silver and also in gold apparently. Now in addition, they might, because obviously this is being produced by Bitspower, I'm assuming they might even reach out to other things like their red and blue. Who knows? We haven't been told if they're going to be doing that. We just said it's a possibility. The other interesting thing is the idea of trying out different tubing varieties as well. So whilst we've only got the acrylic and the PVC tubing at the moment, there are plans for chrome-plated copper tubing as well in the future, and I think that's going to be quite interesting. So hopefully that's given you a better idea as to what Hydro X is looking to offer. Now we're going to be doing a proper build one of these in the future, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss that. And it should be quite interesting seeing how everything performs and what it's like to build with. Now, of course, remember you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Discord, and builds.gg. So if you want to keep up with all the latest news that we've got coming on from there, make sure to pop by those pages. Take care, folks, and I'll see you next time.